How does an army train to believe it fields the best infantry on earth? Explain getting pushed out of positions it held for weeks. What breaks first? The defensive line, or the conviction that holding it should have worked? And what does it mean when the officer writing the after-action report can only reach for one word? Not a tactical term, not a doctrinal critique, but an adjective that sounds more like a complaint about a rich neighbor's spending habits. July 1944. Somewhere southwest of St. Lo, in a hedgerow lane so narrow 2 men couldn't walk abreast, a company commander in the 352nd Infantry Division pressed himself into the root ball of a shattered apple tree and wrote in a pocket diary. American artillery had been falling for 40 minutes. There were no salvos, no disciplined fire-for-effect patterns of the kind German doctrine prescribed. It came in rolling, overlapping curtains that seemed to have no pause built into the fire plan because there didn't need to be one. The ground shook in a frequency that made his pen skip across the page. Somewhere behind the next hedgerow, an American battery, one of apparently dozens, shifted its aim by 50 meters and started the process over again. He wrote one word to describe what he'd witnessed over the previous 72 hours of fighting American infantry in the bocage. Verschwenderisch, wasteful, extravagant, lavish to the point of obscenity. If this kind of deep dive into what the enemy actually thought hits different for you, a like and subscribe keeps this channel producing them. Drop a comment with a battle or a weapon system you want pulled apart next. Those suggestions drive what gets made here. The word sits there in the diary like an accusation, not against the Americans, against the universe. Because Verschwenderisch doesn't mean effective, and it doesn't mean skilled. It means someone is spending resources at a rate that no rational institution should permit. The German officer watching American infantry operate in the hedgerows of Normandy reached for the same word a Prussian grandmother might use watching a child throw bread to pigeons, the waste, the sheer carelessness of abundance. And that word, or words very much like it, appears so frequently in German frontline accounts from mid-1944 onward that it becomes a kind of unofficial diagnosis. American infantry didn't fight the way infantry was supposed to fight. They didn't creep forward under light mortar cover. They didn't rely on the rifle squad as the primary killing instrument. They called in artillery, the way a German platoon leader might call for a medic, reflexively, immediately, for problems that German doctrine expected the infantry itself to solve. An American rifle company pinned by a single machine gun in a hedgerow corner might bring down the concentrated fire of an entire battalion of 105mm howitzers on a target a German company commander would have sent 2 men with grenades to handle. The expenditure of shells per enemy position struck German observers as somewhere between irrational and insane. The 352nd Division had landed at Omaha Beach's reception and understood American willingness to absorb casualties. What they hadn't understood, what the diary entry circles without quite grasping, is that the Americans had built an entirely different relationship between infantry and fires. The rifle squad in American doctrine wasn't the point of the spear. It was the forward observer for a killing system that started 12 kilometers behind the front line. German infantry doctrine put the machine gun at the center. The squad existed to support the MG-42. American infantry doctrine put the radio at the center. The squad existed to find targets for the artillery. 2 systems built on 2 assumptions, fighting completely different wars on the same Norman dirt. The German system required excellent soldiers, highly trained men who could fire and maneuver, who understood dead ground, who could close with a position using speed and aggression, and the Wehrmacht had those soldiers. In July 1944, the average German infantryman in Normandy had more trigger time, more tactical training, more combat experience than his American counterpart. That fact is not disputed by any serious military historian on either side. The German squad in the bocage knew what it meant to fight. What it didn't know, what the diary entry Verschwenderisch tries and fails to capture, is that individual tactical excellence had stopped mattering. The 352nd Division could win the firefight at the hedgerow and still lose the hedgerow, because the American response to losing a firefight at a hedgerow wasn't to send better trained men. The response arrived at 800 feet per second from 3 directions simultaneously, and it didn't care how good the German machine gunners' position selection had been. A file in the Foreign Military Studies series, FMSB 441, written after the war by a German divisional commander for his American captors, uses a phrase that translates roughly as the enemy's willingness to expend ammunition in quantities that made conservation meaningless. The report's author, trying to explain to American Army historians why his division's positions kept collapsing despite sound tactical defense, called the American ammunition expenditure ohne jedes Maß, without any measure. His tone in the document reads less like professional analysis and more like a man describing a natural disaster, a force that couldn't be reasoned with and didn't follow rules. His generals hated the framing, not because it was wrong, because it conceded something they couldn't afford to concede, that the war had moved past the point where German tactical superiority could compensate for American industrial output, converted into high-explosive shells and delivered on a 14-minute call-for-fire timeline. One word in a dead man's diary: Verschwenderisch. To understand why that word mattered more than any battle report, the story has to go back to 1940, to an American army that barely existed, and a set of decisions about how to build one from scratch. The Wehrmacht didn't build its doctrine around scarcity by accident. It built it around scarcity because scarcity was the only material Germany had in abundance. The Reichswehr of the 1920s, the 100,000-man rump army permitted by Versailles, couldn't train with tanks because it didn't have tanks. It couldn't practice combined arms maneuver with artillery because the treaty capped gun numbers at a level that made large-scale live-fire exercises impossible. So it did something that military historians have spent 80 years admiring and 15 years quietly reassessing. It made a virtue of the constraint, Auftrags tactic, mission-type tactics. The word gets thrown around in modern staff colleges like a talisman, but the core concept is simple enough to fit on an index card. Tell a subordinate what to achieve. Don't tell him how. Trust his judgment at the point of contact because you can't possibly see what he sees, and the radio might be dead anyway. A platoon leader in the Wehrmacht carried more tactical authority than an American company commander. He could shift his axis of advance, bypass a strong point, exploit a gap, all without calling back for permission. The system produced extraordinary tactical flexibility at the small unit level. It also produced something less discussed, an institutional belief that cleverness could substitute for mass. By 1939, this belief had hardened into identity. The German officer corps told itself a story, and the story went like this. German soldiers think faster, adapt quicker, and fight with a precision that compensates for being outnumbered. Poland seemed to confirm it. France confirmed it so loudly that nobody in the German high command could hear anything else for 2 years. 6 weeks to defeat the French army, an institution with more tanks, more artillery, more men under arms. The Wehrmacht looked at that result and drew a conclusion that felt like genius and functioned like a trap. The conclusion: material superiority doesn't matter if you achieve tactical surprise and maintain operational tempo. Stuff doesn't win wars. Skill wins wars. The MG-42 is the doctrine made metal, 1,200 rounds per minute. So fast, the human ear couldn't distinguish individual shots, just a continuous ripping sound that American G is called Hitler's buzzsaw. One weapon, one trained gunner, could suppress an entire platoon frontage. The German rifle squad, 10 men, existed to carry ammunition for that gun, protect its flanks, and enable its repositioning. Everything orbited the MG-42, the way planets orbit a star. The system demanded less ammunition per engagement than the American approach because it concentrated killing power in a single platform, served by a single specialist. Elegant and efficient, brilliant even, if you judged it in isolation, and completely dependent on the assumption that the enemy would play by the same rules. German logistics in the East reinforced the habit. The supply lines running into Russia stretched across distances that made consistent resupply a fantasy. A division fighting near Smolensk in 1941 might receive 1/3 of its daily ammunition allocation. Officers learned to hoard shells the way a desert traveler hoards water. Artillery batteries fired with parsimony that would have baffled an American gunner. 3 rounds on a target. Assess, adjust, 3 more. Every shell carried forward by horse-drawn wagon over roads that dissolved into mud every spring and fall. The German word for this careful husbandry, Sparsamkeit, thrift, carried moral weight. A commander who expended ammunition freely drew the same disapproval a Swabian banker might direct at a spendthrift nephew. The name Auftragstaktik itself tells you something. Auftrag means mission, task, commission, something given. Tactic is obvious, but the compound implies a transaction. The superior gives the mission. The subordinate gives back results. It's contractual, personal. The individual officer's skill is the currency. An army that runs on individual skill needs less of everything else. Less ammunition, fewer vehicles, shorter supply lines. The whole edifice rested on the exchange rate between German tactical competence and Allied material weight. Through North Africa, through the Eastern Front's middle years, through Sicily and southern Italy, the exchange rate held. A German division could fight an Allied force twice its size and maintain cohesion. Kesselring's defense of Italy, from late 1943 into 1944, stands as possibly the finest economy of force campaign in modern military history. A retreating army extracting maximum delay from minimum resources across terrain that favored the defender. German officers watched their system work and concluded it would keep working. The FMS series contains dozens of reports where German commanders describe their pre-Normandy confidence. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr division, told American interrogators after the war that his officers expected the invasion to produce a battle of tactics, his phrase, where German defensive skill in the hedgerow country would neutralize Allied numbers. The bocage looked like a gift. Ancient earthen walls topped with dense brush bounded every field. The lanes between them were natural kill zones, and the hedgerows themselves formed ready-made defensive positions that required no engineering. Bayerlein's officers studied the terrain and saw a landscape that rewarded exactly the kind of war they'd spent 5 years perfecting. Small unit actions, ambush and counterattack. The MG-42 behind a hedgerow route system, its beaten zone covering 60 meters of open pasture. A war of skill, decided by the better-trained squad. What arrived instead burned that assumption to the ground, in some cases literally. The American infantry that pushed into the bocage in June and July of 1944 didn't bring better tactics. It brought a fire support system so dense and so responsive that ammunition expenditure ceased to be a consideration, and tactical finesse became irrelevant. The elegant scarcity met something it had no framework to process. Not a better army. A different kind of army entirely. We could not understand their method, Bayerlein told his interrogators. They would not attack without everything. That word, everything, carried a specific weight coming from a man who'd served under Rommel in Africa, where everything meant scraping together enough fuel for one more counterattack. Bayerlein meant it literally. American infantry in the bocage would not cross an open field without prior artillery fire on the objective, without mortar smoke on the flanks, without tank destroyers or Shermans parked hull down at the tree line behind them, and, when the weather cooperated, without fighter bombers circling overhead, waiting for a colored smoke round to mark the target. Every single element had to be in place before the rifle squads moved. To a German officer trained in exploitation of fleeting opportunity, this looked ponderous, slow, wasteful of time and material both. It also looked like an army that didn't trust its own infantry. That reading missed the point so completely, it almost qualifies as a strategic intelligence failure. The American system didn't distrust its infantry. It had simply decided, consciously, at the doctrinal level, in a series of choices made at Fort Sill and the Command and General Staff School between 1940 and 1942, that infantry casualties were a more expensive resource than artillery shells. The math wasn't complicated. Training a rifleman took months. Manufacturing a 105mm high-explosive round took minutes. A dead rifleman couldn't be replaced faster than the shipping pipeline from the United States allowed, roughly 90 days from casualty to replacement arriving at the front. A fired shell could be replaced from the ammunition supply point 6 miles behind the gun line in hours. The American Army looked at those two numbers and built a killing system that burned the cheap resource to protect the expensive one. Steel for blood. The exchange rate ran in one direction only. What did this look like at the hedgerow? The file says plenty. A typical American company-level attack on a single hedgerow-bounded field in July 1944 began with the forward observer, a lieutenant from the supporting artillery battalion, attached to the rifle company, carrying an SCR 610 radio that weighed 32 pounds with its battery. He crawled to a position where he could see the target hedgerow and called a fire mission to his battalion fire direction center. The FDC computed firing data for all 12 guns in the battalion. Within 3 to 5 minutes, the first rounds landed. Here, the technical detail matters because it explains the German reaction. American fire direction centers used a computational method, the graphical firing table and the plotting board, that allowed a single FDC to coordinate all guns in a battalion onto one target simultaneously. The Germans couldn't do this. German artillery batteries fired independently, each battery commander computing his own data. Massing fires from multiple batteries required coordination at regimental level, which added time and radio traffic. An American artillery battalion could mass 12 tubes on a target in under 5 minutes. A German artillery regiment attempting the same concentration might need 15 to 20. The smell of cordite hung in the hedgerow lanes so continuously that soldiers on both sides reported losing their sense of smell within days of entering the bocage. Their noses simply stopped registering it, same as a factory floor becomes silent to the man who works there long enough. But the artillery concentration alone didn't break the German position. The system layered. While the 105s worked the target hedgerow, the company's own 60mm mortars dropped smoke on the flanking hedgerows to blind any German observers who might call counter-battery fire. The company's attached machine gun section, 2 or 3 30-caliber guns, opened suppressive fire on the target hedgerow from a support-by-fire position. If tanks from the attached armor platoon had managed to get forward, and in the bocage, this often meant bulldozing through the hedgerow root system itself, a technique the Americans improvised with welded steel teeth on the Sherman's hull. They added direct 75mm fire into the German position from ranges under 400 meters. Then, the riflemen moved. Across 60 meters of open pasture that the artillery had already churned into mud, and the machine guns kept swept. The German MG-42 gunner in the target hedgerow, if he survived the artillery preparation, if his barrel hadn't been damaged by a near miss, if the concussion hadn't knocked his traversing mechanism out of alignment, had perhaps 90 seconds of clear firing before the American squad reached his position. The FMS reports describe German machine gunners found dead at their weapons, with unfired ammunition belts still feeding into the receiver. Not because they froze, because the suppressive fire from 3 directions made raising their heads above the root line a decision with a life expectancy measured in single-digit seconds. 1 hedgerow, 1 field, 12 howitzers, 3 machine guns, 2 mortars, a tank, and a fighter bomber on standby, for a position held by perhaps 8 men and 2 machine guns. Verschwenderisch. I think the German company commander chose exactly the right word. He just drew the wrong conclusion from it. The waste wasn't a failure of discipline. The waste was the discipline. Every shell that landed on a position already suppressed, every round of 30 caliber that chewed bark off a hedgerow where no living German remained, all of it served the same function. It kept the cost in American blood below the threshold that a democracy fighting a war 3,000 miles from home could sustain across a multi-year campaign. The German system spent men to save shells. The American system spent shells to save men. Both systems reflected the economies that built them. Germany couldn't manufacture enough ammunition to fight the American way. America couldn't train enough elite infantry to fight the German way. Each side made the rational choice given its inputs. Only one side had inputs that scaled. The plotting board measured 18 inches across. a clear plastic disc mounted on a printed base with a pivot arm and a straight edge that rotated around a center pin representing the battery's position. It looked like something a high school geometry teacher might build on a weekend. It cost almost nothing to manufacture, and it broke the German army in Western Europe. The FDC operator, usually a lieutenant or a senior sergeant with 6 months of specialized training at Fort Sill, sat in a dugout or a hedgerow-covered command post anywhere from 1 to 4 kilometers behind the forward observer. When the fire mission came over the radio, he plotted the target's coordinates on the board, read the deflection and range to the guns, applied corrections for weather, powder temperature, and altitude, and transmitted the firing data to all 4 guns in his battery simultaneously. The whole process took between 90 seconds and 3 minutes. Neither the battery commander nor the gun chiefs needed to see the target or compute their own data. The math happened once, in one place, and flowed outward to every tube in the battalion through a telephone wire net that the communications section laid forward each time the guns displaced. Why does the plotting board matter more than the guns themselves? Because the board is what made massing possible. A division artillery officer sitting at a higher echelon FDC could take fire missions from any forward observer in the division and route them to any battalion, or to all 3 battalions of 105s, plus the medium battalion of 155s simultaneously. 36 light howitzers and 12 mediums, 48 tubes converging on a single grid square within 5 minutes of the forward observer keying his handset. The SCR 610 carried his voice to the battalion FDC. A field telephone hardline carried the battalion's request to Division Artillery. Division Artillery's own plotting board computed which battalions could range the target and issued fire orders down separate phone lines to each. The whole network ran on copper wire, hand-cranked telephones, and a plotting instrument that weighed less than a rifleman's helmet. Corps-level massing pushed the numbers further into territory the Germans found incomprehensible. A U.S. infantry division in Normandy controlled 4 artillery battalions organic to the division, 3 light, 1 medium. But the Corps artillery pool added heavy battalions of 4.7-inch guns, 8-inch howitzers, and additional 155 groups that Corps could attach or place in direct support as the tactical situation demanded. During Operation Cobra, in late July 1944, 7th Corps massed over 700 tubes for the preparatory bombardment. The fire plan called for expenditure of 140,000 rounds in a single day across the Corps frontage. That number, 140,000, represented more ammunition than some German divisions on the Eastern Front received in a month. The SCR 536 handy-talkie filled the gap between the riflemen and the fire support net. A small AM radio with a range of about 1 mile, it weighed 5 pounds and fit in a cargo pocket. Platoon leaders used it to talk to their company commander. The company commander used his SCR 300 to talk to battalion. The forward observer used his SCR 610 to talk to the guns. 3 radios on 3 frequencies, layered across 400 meters of a single company's frontage. The German equivalent relied more heavily on runners and landline telephones, systems that artillery fire cut with reliable frequency. An American company that lost its wire could fall back on radio. A German company that lost its wire sent a man running through the barrage. The survival rate for German runners in the bocage does not appear in any file the records preserve, which tells its own story. Above all of it, literally, flew the P-47 Thunderbolt. The cab rank system, borrowed from British practice and refined by IX Tactical Air Command, kept flights of 4 P-47s orbiting above the forward edge of battle at 8,000 feet, waiting for calls from ground controllers. The controller, an Air Corps officer riding in a tank or half-track with the lead infantry battalion, could direct a flight onto a target within minutes. Each P-47 carried 2 500-pound bombs, 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, and 8 50-caliber machine guns with enough ammunition for roughly 18 seconds of firing. The hydraulic fluid that leaked from punctured lines left dark stains on the undersides of the wings, and ground crews at the forward airstrips in Normandy reported the smell. A sharp mineral tang mixed with aviation gasoline. clung to everything within 50 feet of a returned aircraft. The planes came back smelling like the war they'd just delivered. Then there was the proximity fuse. The variable time fuse, VT, contained a tiny radar transmitter in the nose of an artillery shell that triggered detonation when the shell reached a preset distance from the ground. Standard impact fuses exploded on contact, driving most of their fragmentation into the dirt. The VT fuse burst the shell in the air, 15 to 20 meters above the surface, spraying fragments downward across an area 5 times larger than a ground burst. Against troops in open foxholes or behind hedgerow embankments, the effect multiplied casualty rates by a factor the Army's own ordnance studies placed between 3 and 5. The fuse remained classified through most of the war. Ground forces received it for general use in late 1944. German soldiers caught under VT-fused fire had no doctrinal framework for what hit them. Airbursts without the telltale flash of a timed fuse, detonating at exactly the height that maximized lethality, regardless of terrain. The FMS reports contain the phrase, "an artillery we had not previously encountered." Their word, encountered, as though it arrived from somewhere outside the known catalog of weapons, which, for them, it had. Panzer Lehr Division had never been destroyed, not in Normandy's hedgerows through June, not in the grinding attritional fighting around Saint-Lô through the first 3 weeks of July. Bayerlein's division bled, every German division in Normandy bled, but it maintained unit cohesion, conducted local counterattacks, and held positions that American infantry needed days to reduce. By July 24th, Panzer Lehr occupied a frontage west of Saint-Lô, roughly 5 kilometers wide and perhaps 3 deep, anchored on the road from Saint-Lô to Perrier. Bayerlein had roughly 2,300 combat effectives remaining from an original strength north of 14,000. His tank strength had dropped to about 40 operational vehicles. His artillery numbered perhaps a dozen guns with limited ammunition stocks. The division functioned, barely, on the same principles that had carried the Wehrmacht through 5 years of war. Experienced officers, disciplined NCOs, superb small unit defensive tactics, and an institutional refusal to acknowledge that the math had turned terminal. What Bayerlein did not know on the morning of July 25th was that his 5-kilometer frontage had been selected as the carpet-bombing target zone for Operation Cobra. 2,500 aircraft. First came the fighter bombers, 350 P-47s of 9 Tactical Air Command, hitting the forward edge of the target rectangle with 500-pound general-purpose bombs and napalm. Behind them, 1,500 B-17s and B-24s of 8th Air Force, flying in formations so dense they darkened the sky over the target area for the better part of 2 hours. Each heavy bomber carried between 36 and 42 100-pound fragmentation bombs, or a mix of 500-pound and 1,000-pound general-purpose ordnance. Behind the heavies came 396 medium bombers, B-26 Marauders, delivering another wave of fragmentation and high explosive onto whatever the heavies had missed. The total bomb tonnage dropped on Panzer Lehr's positions that morning exceeded 4,000 tons. Concentrated on a target rectangle roughly 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep. The earth moved. That detail appears in multiple German survivor accounts and should not be read as metaphor. The concussion waves from sequential detonations of 1,000-pound bombs created ground shock that physically displaced men in their foxholes, ruptured eardrums at distances of several hundred meters from the point of impact, and, according to Bayerlein's own post-war testimony, threw tanks sideways off their tracks. Soil erupted in columns that hung in the air and merged into a continuous canopy of dust, dirt, and smoke that rose to several thousand feet. The smell that descended on the survivors defied single description. Pulverized limestone from the Norman subsoil, a calcium powder taste that coated the throat and turned saliva to paste, mixed with the hot metal reek of bomb casings and the organic stench of churned earth exposing root systems and field drainage that had been undisturbed for centuries. Bayerlein survived because his command post sat at the extreme eastern edge of the target box. His account, given to American interrogators, uses language that a professional officer trained to write precise situation reports would normally avoid. He called the bombing an inferno and described his division afterward as composed of men who were ikstar, a word that translates roughly as rigid with shock, but carries connotations closer to catatonia. The file records his estimate that 70% of his combat troops in the target zone were killed, wounded, or rendered unable to function. His remaining tanks, the ones not flipped or buried, could not move because the bombing had cratered the roads and lanes so thoroughly that no path wider than a footpath remained passable. 3 of his battalion command posts simply ceased to exist. The communications network, already dependent on landline telephones because German radio equipment in Normandy couldn't match American signals density, vanished under the bomb pattern. Bayerlein lost contact with his forward units entirely for several hours. When runners finally reached what had been his forward defensive line, they found positions that could no longer be identified as positions. The hedgerows that had formed the backbone of every German defensive scheme in the bocage, those ancient earthen walls that Bayerlein's officers had studied and admired as natural fortifications, had been leveled, erased from the terrain as though they'd never grown there. The geometric patchwork of fields that defined the Norman landscape looked, from the air, like a moonscape of overlapping craters. Then, the American ground attack began. And this is where the word Verschwenderisch completed its transformation from complaint to epitaph. 7th Corps, the 1st Infantry Division, the 9th Infantry Division, the 30th Infantry Division, and the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions crossed the line of departure into a defensive zone that no longer existed. The infantry advanced behind a rolling barrage fired by every artillery battalion in the Corps. The armor exploited gaps that the bombing had opened by removing the terrain features the Germans had organized their defense around. American tanks drove through spaces where hedgerows had stood an hour earlier. The resistance Panzer Lehr mounted came from isolated clusters of survivors fighting without communications or coordination, cut off from mutual support, precisely the opposite of the integrated small unit defense that German doctrine demanded and German training enabled. Bayerlein reported to 7th Army headquarters that Panzer Lehr had been destroyed, vernichted. His superiors initially refused to believe him. A panzer division does not get destroyed by air attack. That violated everything the German command structure understood about the relationship between air power and ground forces. Generaloberst Hausser at 7th Army demanded confirmation. Bayerlein sent it. "You can grüß me again from scratch," he reportedly told the staff officer on the other end of the line. "Panzer Lehr is teaching itself to walk." The division that had entered Normandy as arguably the best-equipped armored formation in the German order of battle ceased to exist as a fighting force in under 3 hours. It was destroyed by the application of industrial violence, so concentrated and so indifferent to cost that the German framework for understanding combat simply had no category for it. Generalmajor Rudolf von Gersdorff sat across from his American interrogator in September 1944 and delivered an assessment so precise it read like an engineering specification. The American infantryman, he said, lacked the fieldcraft of his German counterpart, moved clumsily in close terrain, relied too heavily on roads, showed poor noise discipline at night, failed to exploit local successes with the speed that German training demanded. Von Gersdorff had commanded at corps level. He knew what he'd observed. None of it saved him. But when they attacked, the interrogation summary records him continuing, they attacked with everything at once, and they never stopped. He described American artillery as arriving like a factory product, uniform, predictable, relentless, and delivered in quantities that made the skill of the individual German soldier a declining variable in the equation of survival. The file notes that von Gersdorff paused before adding that the Americans seemed to treat ammunition as though it were water. The interrogator's marginal notation reads simply, "Subject visibly frustrated." The same frustration surfaced in every major engagement from Cobra forward. Aachen, October 1944, the first German city to fall. The defending garrison of the 12th Infantry Division and elements of the 116th Panzer Division fought from cellars, sewers, and reinforced buildings with the fanaticism of men defending home soil. German small unit tactics in urban terrain remained superb. Squad leaders used mouse-holing techniques, blowing through interior walls to move between buildings without exposing themselves to street-level fire. They positioned MG-42 teams in upper floors with interlocking fields of fire across intersections. They rigged booby traps in doorways and stairwells. All textbook, all competent. The 1st Infantry Division and the 30th Infantry Division responded by bringing 155mm self-propelled guns to ranges under 200 meters and firing directly into the facades of defended buildings. When a structure proved too resistant, they called in 8-inch howitzers. When the 8-inch rounds couldn't penetrate a reinforced basement, they brought up tank dozers to collapse the rubble on top of whoever remained inside. The casualty reports from Aachen's garrison describe men killed not by bullets or shell fragments, but by structural collapse, buried alive under masonry, that their own defensive preparations had weakened just enough for American heavy-caliber direct fire to bring down. One German company commander captured during the final days of the battle told his interrogators that his men had done everything right, his exact phrasing, as the MIS report preserves it. Tactically, we did not make mistakes. It did not matter. Hurtgen Forest should have been different. The dense timber of the Hurtgenwald negated American air power almost completely. Observation from the air dropped to near zero under the triple canopy. Artillery forward observers couldn't see more than 50 meters in most sectors. The terrain channeled movement along fire breaks and logging trails that German engineers had pre-registered with mortar and artillery concentrations. American casualties in the Hurtgen between September and December 1944 ran staggeringly high. The 4th Infantry Division alone suffered over 7,000 casualties in roughly 3 weeks of fighting in November. German defensive tactics in the forest worked. The Hurtgen cost the Americans more per yard gained than any comparable frontage in the European theater. And it changed nothing. The American replacement system fed fresh divisions into the forest. The 28th Infantry Division broke itself against Schmidt and Kammerscheidt in early November, and the 8th Infantry Division replaced it. The 8th ground down, and the 83rd moved in. Each division arrived with full artillery complements, full ammunition, basic loads, and organic logistics trains that kept hot food reaching battalion rear areas, even when the forward companies ate nothing but K-rations for days. A captured Feldwebel from the 275th Infantry Division told interrogators at the POW cage near Eupen that the Americans he'd fought against in the Hurtgen were the worst trained soldiers we had seen since Normandy. He meant it as a professional assessment. The next sentence in the interrogation transcript reads, "But there were always more of them, and they always had ammunition." The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 provided the final proof, on terms the Wehrmacht chose. German operational surprise achieved complete success on the morning of December 16th. American forward units shattered. Entire regiments of the 106th Infantry Division surrendered. The initial penetration tore a gap 60 miles wide in the American line. For 72 hours, German Panzer spearheads advanced against opposition that ranged from chaotic to non-existent. This looked, briefly, like the kind of war the Wehrmacht understood, fluid, fast, decided by the initiative of aggressive commanders exploiting confusion. Then, Bastogne held, and the American logistics system performed the act that no German staff officer had modeled as possible. Third Army, Patton's Third Army, a force of over 250,000 men with all its supporting artillery and armor, disengaged from active operations on the Saar front, turned 90 degrees north, and attacked into the German southern flank within 72 hours. Moving an army corps across icy roads in winter required fuel, ammunition, rations, and maintenance support in quantities that German planning officers estimated would take a minimum of 2 weeks to stage. Patton's quartermasters did it in 3 days. They burned 11 million gallons of gasoline in the month of December alone. 11th Panzer Division's commander, Generalleutnant Wend von Wietersheim, described the speed of the American response as incomprehensible from a logistics standpoint. Sources conflict on whether von Wietersheim used exactly that word, incomprehensible, or something closer to inexplicable. Either way, What both words point to is the same admission. The German officer corps had spent 5 years refining an art of war built on the premise that superior training and tactical flexibility could overcome material disadvantage. By January 1945, the material disadvantage had grown so vast that tactical flexibility operated inside a space too small to affect outcomes. The best-trained infantry in Europe held every position it defended until the positions ceased to exist beneath them. The rooms smelled like floor wax and stale cigarette smoke. Allendorf, Garmisch, Neustadt, the compounds where the U.S. Army Historical Division housed its cooperating German officers through the late 1940s, had the antiseptic quality of institutions that exist between categories, neither prisons nor universities, something closer to a typing pool staffed by men who'd recently commanded divisions. They wrote on American paper, with American pencils, at American desks. Bayerlein was among them, and von Gersdorff, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, who'd watched Panzer Lehr dissolve under 4,000 tons of American bombs, sat in a heated office in occupied Germany and produced a detailed manuscript explaining to his former enemies exactly how they'd beaten him. The Foreign Military Studies program generated over 2,500 individual reports between 1945 and 1959. German generals, corps commanders, division commanders, staff officers, men who'd spent the war dismissing American tactical ability, now wrote careful, methodical analyses of that same ability for an audience of American Staff College instructors. The reports carried alphanumeric designations: MSB through D series for operational narratives, P series for special topics, each one typed, reviewed, cross-referenced, and filed in the archives at what became the center of military history. The defeated explaining the victorious, in the victor's language, on the victor's payroll. The word Verschwenderisch appears in those files with a frequency that borders on compulsive. I think it bothered them, not as a description, but as a diagnosis they couldn't escape. To call American methods wasteful required believing that a more efficient alternative existed and would have produced the same result. The FMS authors tried. Report after report argues that better-trained infantry could have achieved the same breakthroughs with fewer shells, fewer bombs, fewer trucks, burning fewer gallons of gasoline. The argument sounds reasonable in typescript. It collapses under the weight of a single counter-question that none of them answered. Where was this better-trained infantry supposed to come from after 5 years of attrition on the Eastern Front had killed it? The German officer who scribbled Verschwenderisch in his diary southwest of St. Lo meant it as contempt. His generals, writing the same word in climate-controlled offices 5 years later, meant it as concession. The distance between those two meanings spans the entire arc of the war in Western Europe. Contempt assumes the critic possesses a superior alternative. Concession admits he doesn't. What changed between 1944 and 1949 wasn't the word. What changed was that the men writing it had run out of arguments for why their way should have worked. Some of them never stopped trying. Generalmajor Burkhard Müller-Hillebrand produced a multi-volume statistical study of German army strength and losses that remains a standard reference. His numbers are meticulous. His implicit argument that Germany lost because it lacked the raw demographic and industrial base to sustain a long war, not because its operational methods failed, threads through every table and footnote. He's not wrong about the numbers, but the argument contains its own refutation. If your operational method requires conditions you cannot create, your operational method is the problem. The American way of war did not require genius commanders or 7 years of institutional training to produce a competent squad leader. It required steel, petroleum, electronics, and a replacement pipeline that treated the individual soldier as a component in a system rather than an artisan practicing a craft. The system scaled. The craft didn't. Here is where the cosmic joke lands. The Bundeswehr, West Germany's new army, rebuilt from 1955 onward under NATO, adopted American logistics doctrine almost wholesale, American pattern supply chains, American-style maintenance depots, American ammunition expenditure rates written into operational planning. The army that had sneered at Verschwenderisch methods built its entire Cold War posture around them. Bundeswehr artillery officers trained at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, learning the same fire direction center procedures that had buried Panzer Lehr. They used plotting boards. And the Americans? By 1965, the United States found itself in a ground war in Southeast Asia, where industrial abundance met an enemy who'd studied exactly how to negate it. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong didn't try to match American firepower. They avoided it. They fought at night, in terrain that swallowed bombs the way the Hurtgen had swallowed air power, against an opponent who expended ammunition at rates that dwarfed even the Normandy expenditure tables, and who couldn't translate that expenditure into decisive outcomes because the enemy refused to mass in targetable formations. The word Verschwenderisch, stripped of its German inflection and restated in English, appeared in American domestic criticism of the war. Wasteful, profligate, a nation spending its way through a conflict that spending couldn't solve. The German generals at Allendorf could have appreciated the irony, though most died before it fully matured. What destroyed them became what defined their successors. And what saved the army that destroyed them became, 20 years later, the framework that armies critics used to describe its failure in a different war against a different enemy who'd learned a different lesson from the same history. Bayerlein's FMS manuscript sits in a gray archival box at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Typed pages, double-spaced, with occasional pencil corrections in his own hand. On page 47, describing the Cobra bombardment, he crossed out the word excessive and replaced it with decisive. The erasure mark is still visible, a faint graphite smudge where one word became another, and a German general's entire theory of war reversed itself in the space of an inch.